Liisa Ogburn. She said her definition of wonky is unsteady, irregular, which I have been at times, but that's a different session. An apt description of my path in story gathering. Her superpower said, I'd love to be able to slow down time. For comic relief, I could talk really slowly. But it's also become everything passes so fast these days. Wait, stop! Hold on. Let me get my camera. I yell at my kids. It's over, Mom, they say. So this is Liisa Ogburn with What I've Learned After a Decade of Asking People to Tell Their Story.
Thank you so much. So, getting to the heart of the story, I'm going to tell you some of the lessons I've learned along my wonky path, which has been very uneven. Tonight's story really starts 50 years ago. This story for tonight began December 21st, 1965, when my Finnish mother married my American father. My Finnish grandfather, Ukki, performed the ceremony in Helsinki, Finland, and soon afterwards they boarded an airplane for Raleigh, North Carolina. Last winter, my father said to me, you know, it's going to be our golden anniversary. What do you think of going to Finland with us to celebrate? So my brother and I said, of course. And my father, as we were leaving, said, listen, you're going to hear some stories you've never heard before. How could this be? Anyway, I had not been in Finland with my parents since 1977. This was soon after we arrived with my father and my Finnish grandmother, who we called Mummi, myself and my mom and Eric. I collect stories, and I was intrigued. What hadn't he told us? See, over the last decade, I've been interviewing people. I've interviewed over 1,000 people for a variety of different projects. And tonight I'm going to share 8 lessons. People want to tell their story. In the 1990s, I was working in San Francisco during the big internet boom, and I was surrounded by some amazingly creative people. And I thought, damn, I'm going to put a quest on Craigslist and ask people to come tell me their stories. I got 50 responses right away, including Craig of Craigslist. Stories help us feel less alone. My second project, I was a new mother of 2 young children, and my husband got a job in Japan, and I felt utterly in limbo. So I decided to do a project interviewing women in limbo for different reasons. The third thing I learned was if I was going to work at all with young children, I needed to work within my constraints. We moved from Japan back to Raleigh, North Carolina, added a 3rd child to the mix, and life was busy. My life was really kids, 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 and so that was my constraint. I started working with kids. In one of my projects, I went into my son's 1st grade classroom and asked kids to tell me if they had one wish for the world, their family, or themselves, what would that be? I learned that you have to let projects evolve over time. I decided after 5 years on the verge of all these children graduating to go back and ask the same children the same question. I knew my own dreams had changed, and so had theirs. I learned also that there are times when we need to tell our stories. My father-in-law is currently dying while living with us, and there's nothing he likes more than to have one of us interview him about a story, and this is my daughter interviewing him. I've written a couple of pieces for the New York Times on the lessons we've learned through gathering those stories. StoryCorps founder David Isay said, listening is an act of love, and my neighborhood, Oakwood, helped support me to record the stories of neighbors, interviewing neighbors, and editing these down to play at different events. And in another project that I'm currently working on, I interviewed about 200 women on motherhood and how their experiences as mothers changed them over time. I'm currently developing this into a play. So going back to the story of Finland, we did decide to go to Finland. July 4th, we all met in Helsinki. We stayed in Katajanokka, which is close to the neighborhood where my mother grew up. We ate smoked fish and pickled herring and took saunas every night and walked the streets of her childhood and ended up here at Metodisti Kirkko. This is the outside of the church that I showed you in the very first picture. This is where my parents were married. We walked in right as church was letting out. The minister, Aino, and his wife, Iris, offered us pulla and coffee. My mom ushered us into the sanctuary and closed the doors behind her. She pulled my children and my nephew up to the front, to the altar, and she said, I want you to stand here, right here. I want you to stand. When you get married, I want you to remember that you stood where your Momi and Oki stood and made this promise 50 years ago. And then she held her arms out and she said, and this is the fruit of that promise. I learned that day probably the most important lesson. Listen carefully. You never know how the story is going to end. And often, more often than not, you'll find that it was well worth the wait. Thank you.